Pirates! Aha! When you hear that word, and apparently it's really hard just to say normally, you probably imagine a swashbuckling sailor searching for freedom and treasure in the glistening seas of the Caribbean. What made the Caribbean the hotspot for piracy in the age of sail? When and how did its heyday end? Today I'm joined by Dr. Rebecca Simon, author of Pirate Queens, The Lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. She's the perfect person to navigate the waterways of the past in search of historical buccaneers. Welcome to Echoes of History, Rebecca. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Assassin's Creed Black Flag recreates the Caribbean during the Golden Age of Piracy. We get to see fantastic places there. We also get to see some of the most famous figures from this period of history, from Blackbeard to Anne Bonny and people like those. But there were pirates in that part of the world before the early 18th century, which is when the game is set. So I wondered if you could tell us, to start off with, when do pirates first begin to emerge in the Caribbean? When does piracy start there?
So piracy, as we really know of and think about when it comes to the Caribbean, really begins in the 1600s. And kind of in the mid-1600s is when we start to see these buccaneers become really active. And buccaneers was kind of like an earlier term that we use for pirates within this region. And a lot of them were actually French pirates who tended to fight against the Spanish, because the Spanish had been harassing a lot of the French pirates down in that region, kicking them off their own plantation islands. They're kind of doing a lot of back and forth. But we are also starting to see the presence of a lot of British pirates, or privateers would actually be a bit more accurate. This is where they're legally sanctioned to kind of work as pirates for a particular government. And this is when we're going to start to see that become more active, as Britain is becoming a lot more competitive with Spain, as they're trying to get their own plantation colonies really up and running or becoming a lot more powerful. So in the 1600s, this is when we're going to start to see people like Henry Morgan, who was going after Spanish ships and famously sacked Panama and Panama City, and then got a governorship out of it despite all of the destruction it caused. We are going to start seeing a lot of fights and war break out between the British and the Spanish as well, starting around in the 1650s. And then they're going to be using privateers on either side, really, to attack each other. And many of these British privateers will be arrested by the Spanish. And so within the Caribbean, in terms of kind of organized piracy, what we're seeing is kind of a lot of government sanctioned piracy, or sort of like little groups of pirates, little groups of people kind of fighting with each other. But in terms of the organized pirates, we think of, like, as you said a few minutes ago, Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, Mary Read. That was a very unique group of pirates to emerge in the 1700s.
So do we need to think about the early piracy there as being quite closely tied to the political struggles for control of the New World?
Yeah, I would say so. There's a lot of struggle for the New World happening at this point, because you've had the Spanish coming in. They've already been there for like a century, basically, really building up their own empire. They're the wealthiest nation in Europe. Britain has actually been behind the game in terms of colonization. You know, Spain had been colonizing. France had even started dabbling with their colonization in the Caribbean, although they were more focused on Canada, modern day Canada. And so Britain really doesn't start getting into the colonization game until the early 1600s. So they have catching up to do. But they've really beefed up their navy. And so their navy is quickly becoming probably the most powerful navy in the world, which makes them quite formidable to the Spanish. And they're also very wealthy at the turn of the 17th century, coming off the heels of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. So they're coming in, and this is when they're going to start being able to try to take their own plantation islands. They start fighting over the Spanish for certain pieces, especially Jamaica in particular is going to become very, very heavily contested. And it's kind of like, once you control Jamaica, you can control the entire Caribbean. Eventually, the British and the Spanish, though, they will come to agreements as to who can control what. Spain is going to be able to keep modern-day Cuba as long as Britain protects them from pirates. Britain is going to get Jamaica. So, but a lot of this is really born out of this huge political struggle for control of the Caribbean.
And what kind of people will become pirates? I mean, you mentioned privateers, almost, as you said, legally sanctioned pirates in a way. But what kind of people end up being what we would think of as pirates?
So the vast majority of people who become pirates generally were privateers. Once their contract runs out, they kind of continue their work and they're working for themselves. They already had a reputation of doing so, and a lot of them became privateers because they would get a pardon for being pirates if they worked for the government, meaning that they wouldn't get arrested for any crimes or anything like that. But if you weren't a privateer, who did it if you weren't a privateer? These were going to be people who probably also had other maritime experience, maybe people who had once worked in merchant ships, maybe on the rare occasion naval ships. There's an argument that says a lot of people would want to come onto a pirate ship because you would get better pay, better food, better working conditions. And it is true, you could make a lot of money being a pirate. You did have better access to better quality food because of ships you would rob. About half of the items you'd steal, you'd keep. So there is an argument to be said about people having a better life. And then speaking of which, you might get some people who had history of criminal behavior and couldn't get work elsewhere, or maybe were trying to escape something. On occasion, you might have an escaped enslaved person or someone who had been enslaved and couldn't find work elsewhere. Or, and this is very common, people, at least they claimed, people claimed that they were forced into it, captured by pirates and then forced to kind of join the crew. Although this is what they would claim when they were put on their trials later.
Yeah, it seems like a really good way to get yourself out of trouble. They made me do it. And I guess we should also consider why these people are turning up in the Caribbean. You know, if you want to be a pirate and you're European, these are all Europeans who are making their way over there. There's the Mediterranean. There's stuff closer to home that you could be doing. What's the lure of going all the way to the Caribbean to engage in this kind of work?
The Caribbean is almost kind of like untapped territory in a way, because yes, the Mediterranean is ripe for trade. It's ripe for goods and pirating. But the thing is, it's a very organized region. You've already got like the Ottomans who are very active in those waters. Don't want to mess with the Ottomans. And so the Caribbean is kind of this whole new like region really for Europeans to be able to go and make something of themselves. But because it was also under so much political contention, this means that it was really difficult to enforce the law. And so when there's war happening, when you're having a constant change in leadership, which is what's happening with the different islands, and also a lot of the laws that you're supposed to obey aren't necessarily translating over into the Caribbean because people are kind of just ruling as they feel they should. This creates a really good environment for people to come in and engage in illicit activities without too much consequence, especially because with the wars between the Spanish and the British, there were trading restrictions. The Navigation Acts were passed in 1651. And what this did is it banned anyone from the British Empire, as they called it, from trading with anyone outside of the British Empire or any of its colonies. And so pirates are indiscriminately robbing ships, and they're actually working with a lot of these British governors in charge of these different plantation islands and even some of the North American colonies to be able to trade their goods in exchange for money and protection. So it's kind of a perfect storm of political instability, lack of a definition of who's actually really in charge in a lot of places. And it's just the perfect recipe to create a region for piracy.
Yeah, I suppose the lawlessness helps. And there's also an appeal in, it's kind of like a pirate startup, isn't it? You know, the Mediterranean is pretty locked down. You've got the Ottomans doing a great job of the piracy there. All of the trade routes are fairly well established and people are quite good at securing their own ports and coastlines in the Mediterranean. And then you've got this whole kind of, almost like the Wild West of the sea out in the Caribbean. It's almost like a startup in which, you know, pirates can suddenly get rich.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy right there.
And then we see kind of privateers begin to emerge in the early 16th century then, initially, I think, engaged by the King of France to target kind of Spain and Portugal. And I guess then we have the argument that to the French, these people engaging in this aren't pirates. To the Spanish and Portuguese, they very definitely are pirates. Do we get a sense of how pirates identified themselves? Did they consider themselves pirates?
That's kind of an interesting question to ask, if pirates consider themselves pirates, because they didn't really leave a lot of their own records. According to research I've done reading trial transcripts, pirates never really seemed to consider themselves to be pirates. They would always claim that they were innocent or that they were working on behalf of governors. A lot of pirates, their argument was that if they're stealing goods, it was to benefit somebody else. And so therefore, you couldn't really argue that they were pirates. Now, there were some, of course, who did identify this way. This was especially in the case going into the 18th century when we had the really organized bands of pirates after the end of the War of Spanish Succession. But for the most part, these pirates kind of coming in, they're basically arguing, especially in the 1600s, we're defending ourselves. We're defending our home. We're defending our island. We're defending our governor or our government, or we are sanctioned to go after any enemy ship at any time. So in the 1600s, I don't think anyone would be ready to call themselves a pirate. They all felt very justified in what they were doing.
I'm not a pirate. I'm a privateer. I'm doing this entirely legally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And, privateers, they had a contract called a letter of marque, and, they're written down. You have to carry this on your ship. It would be pretty easy to argue that, the letter of marque was taken, it got burned or got lost in battle or while we were attacked or something like that. I am speculating a little bit because I haven't seen claims of this happening, but I think this would be a very likely claim or excuse if someone wasn't able to really produce a letter of marque. In fact, I think the pirate Captain Kidd, or the accused pirate Captain Kidd, who operated in the East Indian Ocean, that was kind of a big point of contention there. He said he had a letter of marque and it was unable to be produced. But you can see it at the National Archives in Kew. So it was there. It did very much exist.
And when might a privateer who is acting on behalf of their government, when might they cross a line into becoming a pirate? What were the kind of things, where was that line that moved you from a privateer to a pirate?
Generally, that line would be crossed in two ways. One, it would be going after people who you're not supposed to attack. Because a letter of marque specified, they're usually issued during wartime or times of contention. So, you are specified to attack these Spanish ships in this area. But if you go rogue and you go to a different area and you start attacking French ships, well, the French, of course, they're going to capture you and they're going to say, hey, Britain, your pirates attacked us. And Britain is then going to have the massive legal headache of being like, oh, no, they're privateers, but no, they weren't actually supposed to attack you. And kind of like what you were saying earlier, every person's privateer is going to be somebody else's pirate. And so this is always going to be like a big problem. So you have to make sure that your privateers are skilled enough to try to not get captured. So that way they won't be accused of piracy and thus starting more issues. The other big line for people to cross would be if a privateer just decides to go rogue and start only acting for themselves, robbing any ship they feel like, keeping all the goods for themselves without turning things over to the government, without actually following what the letter of marque says. That's really what piracy is, when you're robbing for yourself without any heed of the government. Or, of course, if you start attacking your own government ships. But privateers weren't going to do that because that is, you can't argue your way out of that one.
Were letters of marque usually for a specified period of time as well? Could it expire? And if you carried on, beyond the period that the government had said you could behave in this way, could that get you trapped into being a pirate?
Yeah, there were stipulations in the letter of marque, usually attacking these specific enemy ships in this region during this time. And for the most part, they were issued during times of war. So essentially, a letter of marque would be good until the war was over. Or if you're kind of being sent to go to a specific region, maybe to protect your trade or try to get rid of any competition, then it'll say, while you are in this area, you are a privateer. So it won't necessarily be a hard expiration date, but kind of like once you're in this region, you have jurisdiction to be a privateer. So you really did have to adhere to that. Many pirates in the 18th century had been privateers during the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted from about 1701 to 1713, and a lot of it was fought on the sea. When that war ended, these letter of marques were no longer valid, and so many of those privateers actually went on and became pirates, usually either pirates or pirate hunters, depending on what their position was and what their actual, basically whatever it is that they wanted to do. Some found it more lucrative to be a pirate hunter. Some, of course, wanted to kind of go and set up on their own and go on pirating to get wealth themselves.
I guess it's tricky, isn't it? Because if a government kind of spends, 12, 13 years creating this fleet of people who are very good at what they do, hopefully they want them to be good at it, and then all of a sudden you say, that's it now, the war's over, you can stop. You've suddenly got this group of people who've got a very particular set of skills. And what else are they going to do with it now? You know, are they going to give up this life that they've developed, which they may well have made an awful lot of money at, and go back to do what? You know, to some extent, it feels like the government are leaving them with, I'm not going to say no option, but it's not a very appealing option to suddenly stop behaving the way that the government has been paying you to behave.
Yeah, exactly. You know, if you're lucky enough as a pirate, it is pretty lucrative. Like, let's say you become a pirate and you could work on a pirate ship for maybe 1 or 2 years and make enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life and retire. You know, who's not going to want to retire after just a year or two of work, right? And we'd all love to. And so this is what a lot of pirates were after. They wanted to get wealthy pretty quickly. But a lot of pirates also were very much into it for the adventure. You know, most pirates, you know, they make their money or they steal their goods, they go on shore, they sell their goods to get the cash, or trade it for cash. And then they're going to go and spend it for the most part. They're going to the taverns, they're going to brothels, sending money home to families, if they have families, maybe even to some local communities, depending on where they're from. There were pirates who were almost seen as heroes, depending on where they were, because of the money and the goods that they brought in. And so, you know, when they basically ran out of money, they would often go back to pirating. Pirates generally liked working as pirates because they were working for themselves. They didn't really answer to any particular government. You could get wealth in the way that you wanted, and also just there is this sense of adventure. You know, I've read in so many places that a lot of people, when they work at sea, it's because they're very, very, very drawn to it. Like they almost need to be there. It's their environment. And so, you know, that's who these people are. Pirates. All pirates are sailors, and so they're going to stay after that life.
You know, we're still in a world that is fairly rigidly structured in terms of society and being able to move through society. So here is a way that you can kind of wipe all of that away. You can do away with all of that social structure, and you can become as rich as you dare to try and become, I guess. You know, there can't be many other places, many other jobs. Is pirating a job? Is being a pirate a job? I don't know. But there can't be many other professions in which you have the kind of freedom that pirates must have been enjoying.
No, you didn't have very many professions where you could do that at all, really. Society was so rigidly structured, especially during the 17th and 18th century. You know, you're kind of locked in to what it is that you do. If you're wealthy, if you're an aristocrat, of course, that's where you're going to have a lot more freedoms. You know, landowners, titles, you could get a governorship just because, you know, because your friend wanted you to, and government said, you know, here's a governorship for you. But if you were kind of going more into what we would call working class or into the lower classes, you're very locked in. If you're a merchant, that's what you do. If you're working in some other professional capacity, maybe banking, legal, shop owning, other types of mercantilism, that's who you are. That's what you're doing. And if you're from the lower classes, you're a laborer of some sort, whether it's on land, whether it's on sea, whether it's in a household, that's what you're doing. Whereas on a pirate ship, your origins didn't necessarily matter. You know, you could be someone from a very poor family on a pirate ship and you can kind of work your way up into a pretty good position. You could be from a very wealthy family and you still have to kind of answer to the captain, and you are all still considered to be kind of a pretty, I don't really want to say equal society, because not even a pirate ship was completely equal, but everybody had a say in terms of rulemaking, punishment decisions, what types of goods to steal. You were able to kind of have a lot of that authority, or at least you were able to have a voice in that sense. So this was a place where you weren't really being held very rigidly in the sidelines like you might be if you worked in any other area during this time period.
Yeah, and I guess the payoff for that extra bit of freedom is the risk that you take in being a pirate, that if you get caught, it's likely to be your life.
Yeah, exactly. And for a lot of people, you know, they felt the risk was worth that. And it was risky. Most pirates, when they became pirates, they would maybe last about 2 years doing this before they were either captured, before they were killed in battle, maybe killed in some sort of accident. So it was not a long lifespan being a pirate. If you go and you look up like pretty much all the major pirate captains, most of them will have been pirate captains for between 1 and 3 years. You do have the occasional outlier of people doing it for much longer, but that's very much the exception, not the rule.
Wow. Yeah, I think if I'd ended up being a pirate, I would probably have retired after a year. I can see retired at 23 with your feet up, former pirate, living the life. But I guess it becomes a bit addictive as well if you're not too careful.
Probably, we might get the next one. We might have fun. We might have this battle, might have this adventure. It's all really fun until the reality hits.
And it's something very human, isn't it? It's a lot of the films that we might watch today that are about, professional bank robbers or whatever else. They're always chasing the next big hit, aren't they? There's always the next payoff will be the big one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's what pirates were after. They wanted to be able to get as good of a payoff as possible. It wasn't necessarily a massive Spanish treasure ship all the time. It was usually local merchant ships. That's where the money was.
You mentioned that there are some transcripts of pirate trials, but also that we don't hear kind of stories from the pirate's perspective, the pirate point of view either. So I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about the kind of the sources that we have for the Golden Age of Piracy. How do we know what was going on?
You have to look at a lot of kind of peripheral sources in a way. So yeah, most pirates didn't leave records. The ones who did were more from like the 1600s, people like maybe Henry Morgan, the people who were able to make like really successful lives out of it. But again, very much the exception, not the rule. And so when I'm researching pirates, what I'm looking at is a lot of government documents because they're the ones who are writing down everything that's going on. So the Calendar of State Papers, for example, the Calendar of State Papers colonial series for the Americas and the West Indies, that is a huge treasure trove, no pun intended, to find information about pirates because it's correspondences between governors and other officials, these officials and those back in Parliament or other positions of law back in England, and basically keeping them updated, everybody updated about the goings-ons. And this will include if there's been cases of piracy, if there's been known pirates harassing certain areas or been causing problems, what do we do? And then you'll find responses. So this is where I got, I think at least half my research came from the Calendar of State Papers. There's also the High Court of Admiralty records. And these are really important. These are, I would go to the National Archives for these. And the High Court of Admiralty was the maritime legal body, or it is the maritime legal body of Britain. And so anytime a pirate is being captured or warrant for its arrest or any sort of account being written about these pirates, it's being recorded by the High Court of Admiralty. So you go through all these books and you're going to find tons of information about all kinds of pirates, whether they're ones you've never heard of or whether they're some of the really famous ones. And then you go for printed sources. So there's a lot of printed material. Newspapers are really valuable because newspapers were often reporting instances of piracy. Sometimes it would be a whole article about who the pirate was and their trial and then a public execution because pirates who were found guilty of piracy were publicly executed by hanging. And people would go to hangings. It was a huge form of entertainment. We're very morbid creatures. So people are going to see who are these pirates. Let's go watch them hang. And newspapers will usually report this. Sometimes there'll just be notices of just simply like a group of pirates attacked a merchant ship off the coast of Salem or something like that. It could be very, very brief, but still it's pretty valuable because it tells you, okay, so this is where pirates are at this time. And it's worthy of being reported for various reasons. It's a maritime community or because people want to read about it. And pirate trials were transcribed. A lot of them were printed and sold. At this point, going into the 1700s, it was so cheap and easy to be able to buy printed material because of the printing press, the lift in a lot of censorship laws that existed. Literacy has been increasing. And these are things that are selling. People want to read it. And so there are tons of these printed sources you can access in person in various archives, such as the British Library, or a lot of them have been digitized on other various sources as well. You can find a lot of them on the Old Bailey Digital Archive because they've got all kinds of their cases up there. Not nearly as many because pirates weren't tried by the Old Bailey. They were tried by the Court of Admiralty, but it's still another place. So there's lots of places you can look, and a lot of it is literally just kind of sifting through and just finding random pieces of information elsewhere. So you have those kind of specific government sources, printed sources, trial, legal sources, and then sometimes you might just stumble across kind of some interesting other quick accounts.
I mean, the pirate trials in particular, so Anne Bonny's trial takes place in the game, and it does feel, I think, very much like the game has kind of taken that script of the trial and recreated it for us in the game. You know, they've stuck very closely to the transcript of her trial. And I guess the other part of what a game has to do, they did have the benefit of that to help recreate the history. The other thing they have to do is show us an image of Anne Bonny, what she looks like. How much do we know about what some of these pirates look like? You know, how much license has the game had to take when they're trying to recreate Anne Bonny? Does her trial tell us anything about what she looked like?
Trials don't give a lot in ways of physical description for the most part. We don't know much about how Anne Bonny looked. The only thing we have to go on are the woodcuts that were used for the publication of General History of the Pirate, which, again, those are some of the only images we have of major pirates such as Blackbeard, and Anne Bonny, and the other female pirate, Mary Read. In the trial transcript, the women were mostly just simply described by what they looked like as pirates. People who had been captured and survived were eyewitnesses at the trial, and they described them as having long hair, wearing male clothing, and knew that they were women due to the largeness of their breasts, which was how it was described. And then otherwise they wore female clothing when they weren't fighting. But those are really all the descriptions that we have. So what the game kind of has to do, I imagine, is, you know, they're reading the trial transcript. And I know Assassin's Creed, they've done their research. They do their research on these games. And from what I've researched about it, I think they've paid even more attention to historical detail for Black Flag, which is awesome. As a pirate historian, you know, I love that. But they're going to have to kind of look at these trial transcripts, and they're going to have to look and see what are kind of the illustrations from that time period. And they're probably going to have to go based on that and then other illustrations that pop up. So a really famous image of Anne Bonny comes from a cigarette ad in the 1800s. And this shows her having red hair. And that's because she's Irish. She's from, I believe, County Cork originally. And stereotypically, what color hair do a lot of Irish people have? Red hair. So that's kind of where we have this idea that she was a redhead, essentially, kind of from the cigarette ad. And so that's been adopted by pop culture. So you're kind of having to take a lot of this. It's almost like a game of telephone over the centuries of what people look like and just kind of creating your own image that's unique for the game, but also taking familiar elements of what pirates were and how pop culture in all kinds of ways have shown Anne Bonny off before.
Yeah. And before we move away from source material, you mentioned there a general history of the pirates and piracy. How reliable is that? Because I imagine it's not being told from the pirate's point of view, as you say. Is it a hostile source? Can we rely on that as a source of detail about what pirates were up to?
I wouldn't call it a hostile source, but it's definitely one to take with a massive grain of salt, a huge piece of rock salt, really. A lot of it was very heavily exaggerated for the time. It was published in 2 volumes. Volume 1 is a bit more straightforward. It's a bit more accurate, trying to be true to history, with pirates such as Captain Kidd being written about in that one. And then Volume 2 comes out, and that's where you're going to have a lot more outlandish tales of pirates, kind of lesser known ones. But in general, it was meant to be a very popular book, and it was a bestseller. You can still buy copies of it really easily in bookstores or online, and it was meant to sell. And so kind of really took these stories of pirates and just really built up kind of almost this romantic or adventure story idea about them. So the problem with the book is that you can get an idea of what some of these pirates are like, but then there tends to be sort of almost a domino effect of maybe people starting to take it as fact, which is where we start to get into a lot of kind of pirate misconceptions or romanticized pirates that end up dominating the narrative. So Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the female pirates, they are particular victims of this, being very heavily fictionalized. Their story in the book is pretty much pure fiction. And a lot of it is because we don't have any information about them outside the trial transcript. So, and maybe a few other random sources, like a warrant for their arrest from the governor of the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers, a possible piece of criminal evidence for a woman named Mary Read before she was known as a pirate, but we don't know if it was actually her. The author, Captain Charles Johnson, builds out their stories being like, oh, these were women who were both raised as boys for periods in their life and decided, Mary Read joins the army disguised as a man, and Bonny runs away with a sailor, and, they all come together and they meet. But a lot of that was, again, we don't know what the origins was, so it was very much built up for the book. And in fact, even in the title, it specifically says, including the story of Mary Read and Anne Bonny. So clearly using them as a selling point. So it's a really good piece of history to look at if you want to see how is the public consuming pirates? How are they being portrayed? How can we match this to what the actual legitimate sources say? So if you're looking at it through that lens, it's a very good piece of historical evidence for pirates, but it's not one to look at if you're looking for factual information.
And while we're on general history of the pirates, there are a few of those female pirates in the game. Anne Bonny, Mary Read are in there, Lucy Baldwin. Do we have much evidence around female pirates? Do we have any sense of how common they were? Were women allowed to become pirates?
We don't have a lot of information about female pirates, especially during this time period that the game is set in, called the Golden Age of Piracy. The only two that we actually have a lot of information about are Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and it is because their trial was written and it was published and anybody could read it. And then, of course, also a general history of the pirates really kind of builds up a lot of their own mythology for that. But in terms of other pirates during the age, we might see the occasional, in my research, I think I saw maybe 1 or 2 times the mention of a woman in a group of pirates that were arrested. Nothing else. A lot of pirates did not allow women onto ships, supposedly. Like Blackbeard banned women from coming onto the ships. Also young boys, which is a whole other conversation of speculation, because it was felt that women could cause jealousy, they could cause other problems, they wouldn't be able to physically or emotionally be able to handle the work. And also just at the time, women were expected to really be in their own social and gender role. Women were at home, they were taking care of the children. Maybe they were working in shops or taverns or inns, but generally women weren't really known to become sailors. It is possible that there were women who could. In fact, we do know that a lot of times ship captains might bring their wives on board and their wives would actually have equal status to the captain. I don't mean that it means that she could rule the ship, but what I mean is that she was afforded the respect of the captain. And oddly enough, Anne Bonny, she was married, or at least on their ship, she was married to Jack Rackham, who was the captain of the ship. So that would have afforded her that status traditionally. Sometimes you did have women who worked on ships, usually in preparing the food, maybe nursing, maybe repairing, but that was pretty rare, and they might usually be doing that because they were passengers or they were a passenger with their husband. So in general, women weren't really known to be going on to ships during this time. Women weren't really known to be becoming pirates. And I think this is why Anne Bonny and Mary Read have been so built up in history and during this time, is because of how unusual it was that not only do we have documented evidence, but they were so active doing it. And they weren't pirates for long. They only sailed for 2 months as pirates, just August to October of 1720. And yet they become so infamous. And I think the fact that they became so infamous tells us how unusual it was and how unlikely it was for women to be pirates during this age.
I'm slightly disappointed in pirates now, though, because they're out here smashing all of these societal norms and allowing anybody to make a life for themselves, but still indulging in this misogyny. And, it's great that men can get on in the world, but we don't want women getting on in the world. Slightly disappointing now.
It's a bit disappointing, yeah, but I guess, pirates weren't exactly as forward thinking as we like to think that they were. They were products of their time, just like everybody else.
And I'm also in there, I'm probably falling into that romantic trap of imagining pirates as nice people, which they very much weren't.
Yeah, I'm sure just like anybody else, there were some kind ones, but, for the most part, yeah.
One other aspect I wanted to ask about, so players of the game are able to sail ships in the sea in the game, and you can take them from any kind of empire, British or Spanish or whatever, and they could be merchant ships or warships or anything else like that. And this might be a stupid question, but it makes me wonder, I can go and sail a ship in Black Flag. I can't sail a ship in real life. Did you actually have to be a good sailor to be a pirate? You said before that every pirate is a sailor. Does that necessarily mean they're all good sailors?
Not all of them were good sailors. The ones who were in positions of power on a pirate ship, like captain, quartermaster, lieutenant, first mate, navigator, these were people who they were sailors and they had careers as sailors. There were people who in lower positions who maybe had very little experience at sea or no experience at sea. And so these are people who are going to be on the ship doing a lot of the menial work, cleaning, the whole swabbing the deck sort of thing. Probably, being like doing the errands, being the runners for people, getting things for people. And so, those are going to be the people who didn't have much sailing experience coming onto a pirate ship. And then, over the time, they are going to get that experience and then they can kind of move up the ladder. If you're going to be in a position of any sort of leadership, yeah, you will have extensive experience as a sailor. That is expected. You're not going to want somebody who doesn't know anything about sailing to captain a ship. This happened once with the pirate Stede Bonnet, oddly enough, who sailed with Blackbeard as part of a fleet. Stede Bonnet was from Barbados, and he was a plantation owner. And he decided one day he wanted to be a pirate. So he left his family, left his home, bought a ship, hired a crew, declared himself as captain, paid everyone a salary, and went sailing and made lots of bad decisions, leading him have a permanent injury. And a lot of his crew thought he was quite incompetent. And so it's kind of one of those things. He thought of himself as being in charge when it was really the crew who was doing everything else. So, but again, very much the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, that'd be me on a ship, that would. And the other side of what we imagine pirates being very good at is fighting, engaging in lots of naval battles and seizing ships and everything else. I mean, do we know to what extent they were trained soldiers? Were they good fighters?
It depends on kind of their origins. Those who had been privateers would have had more fighting experience, and there were probably some maybe who came from the Navy, maybe who came from other military backgrounds. But I think the vast majority of them, they're going in there with their guns and swords and hoping for the best, really. Fighting on a ship, it's very chaotic, very tight spaces, people running around. And really at that time, when people are going to be fighting in battle and killing each other, it's really as a way to sort of almost protect themselves, kill someone because they might kill me. And I think it was mostly quite haphazard. It wasn't very organized when people were going to fight. So actually pirates in a lot of ways weren't that violent and didn't fight the way we think and didn't fight very much. They would go in there brandishing their swords and their guns, yes, but usually to intimidate the other ship, to get them to surrender. In fact, ships knew when they were being approached by a pirate ship. They would know because pirates would put up their flag once they were close enough so the other ship couldn't go away. And that was to give them the chance to get ready, not to get ready to fight, but to get ready to be like, oh God, we're going to be boarded and they're going to try to get stuff. Okay, what can we do to try to mitigate the damage here? What can we do to try to decrease the risk? Because pirates wanted to decrease that risk as well. They didn't really want to fight very much. That said, fights did break out. People did die in battle, and there were some pirates who were ruthless. There were some pirates who were known to burn ships. You had the pirate Ned Lowe, who was known to torture victims. You had the pirate Charles Vane, who was known to be extremely violent and also set fires to ships. But again, we know about them doing that because of how unique that was and how terrifying it was, because generally pirates in a lot of ways were a nuisance. In fact, the Royal Navy didn't even put a lot of resources into going after them.
One of the other groups I wanted to just talk about briefly as well is you mentioned that formerly enslaved people might end up on pirate ships, and Black Flag and Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry include a character, Adewale, who is a former enslaved man who acts as quartermaster on the ship. So how much do we know about how many kind of non-Europeans were getting involved in piracy? Do we have a sense of whether that was prevalent, or was that another small number like the female pirates?
Pirate ships were pretty diverse. About half of pirate ships were generally British, Irish, were colonists. And then the other half, there were a lot of other people. You might have some French, you might have Spanish, Portuguese, German, Italians. Very occasionally, I would run across a record of someone being Asian on a ship. And yes, there would be Black people on ships. It didn't happen that often, but I would say, I did run across a lot of mentions of a Black pirate being captured on the ship. Now, many of those Black pirates did have origins from slavery for the most part, whether they'd been freed or whether they had escaped. So a lot of times they might find their places on a pirate ship. And there were, in fact, and usually if a black pirate, unfortunately, if they were captured, they were often sold back into slavery, I believe. They usually weren't included in the group trials of pirates. But a lot of pirates, they would sell enslaved people, when they're robbing ships and they're taking cargo. Slaves were cargo. And so there were a lot of times where pirates, counted slaves as cargo and would then sell them because slaves brought so much money in. If they might have a particular skill, then maybe someone who was enslaved could be absorbed into the crew. And this did happen. So, you might have, but they would usually be in more menial positions on the ships. Pirates, a lot of them, for the most part, they were pretty racist as well. Now, Blackbeard, whose name is really Edward Teach, he caught the slave ship La Concorde and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. And it had loads of enslaved people on it, and he did absorb them into his crew. And so we think Blackbeard was really altruistic and, he rescued slaves, but then later he sold them at slave market. So there are rumors that Blackbeard's kind of number one confidant, secondhand man, was a black man on the ship, but we don't know that for fact. I think he was known as Black Caesar, but we know very little information about this particular person. But I think it's been kind of built up throughout history. So yes, there were black people on ships. Ships were very diverse, but not as much as we'd like to think.
And we hear about lots of pirates. We've talked about trial transcripts and things like that. Lots of pirates coming to sticky ends if you got captured. There are instances of ones who had surrendered to the King's pardon in 1718, and we'll come back to one of those in particular. I think Benjamin Hornigold we'll come back to in another episode that we're going to do all about the Pirate Republic, which I'm looking forward to. And the game doesn't shy away from showing the kind of the brutal and the harsh punishments and the executions that pirates would suffer if they were captured and found guilty. Does this help us understand how the golden age of piracy kind of comes to an end? Are pirates hunted to extinction? Does piracy just peter out as a viable way of making a living?
Pretty much, yeah. I would say petering out is a perfect description, really, by the late 1720s. When pirates were captured, they were put on trial, and it was a very public trial, and then they would be executed. That was pretty much the standard punishment for a pirate. In London, they would be taken to Execution Dock in Wapping, and they would hang on the banks of the Thames as kind of a symbolic gesture of where they committed the crime. In the Americas, they had this very similar system. They would arrest pirates, put them on trial, and also execute them. And these were very public trials, and it's a way we can find out tons of information because these pirate trials are kind of the only place where we actually hear from the pirates themselves based on the transcriptions. But over time, the risk versus reward, it became too imbalanced for pirates to really feel that it was lucrative enough to be a pirate. When Woodes Rogers came onto the scene in about 1717-ish, he becomes the royal governor of the Bahamas. And the Bahamas was a huge receptacle for pirates at this point because that's where Nassau is, where a huge chunk of the game takes place. It's the Pirate Republic, like you just mentioned. And so this is where many, many pirates congregate. And it's a good spot for them to do so, and I know we'll talk about this in the future, but, just briefly, it's in a really good spot in terms of trading lanes, being off the coast of Florida, perfect gateway to the Caribbean, but also just the way the islands are set up. It's just a really good place for smaller ships to sail through versus larger ships. And also the Bahamas wasn't really exactly a big producing cash crop colony. And so there wasn't a lot of priority for it. In fact, Woodes Rogers didn't even take a salary. He was kind of self-funded in a way to become this governor, but his goal was to get rid of pirates. And the big thing was by really enforcing the proclamation for the act of the effectual suppression of piracy, which was allowing for pardons. And so pirate takes a pardon. He admits what he did. He gives up the names of his crew. He's allowed to keep his goods, and he's not going to be arrested. And he can often go find legitimate work, oftentimes as a privateer. And Woodes Rogers, I think, pardoned over 100 or 200 pirates while he was governor. Many of them would go back to pirating, but, by the 1720s, many of the major pirate captains who led fleets had been killed, such as Blackbeard, Sam Bellamy, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane. These are really infamous pirates who were all veterans from the War of Spanish Succession. They all knew each other and they had died. Their crews had scattered. At this point, the Royal Navy has kind of really expanded and they're not focusing too much on pirates, but they've expanded enough and they've really restricted laws against piracy. And they've expanded maritime laws to the point where it just wasn't worth being a pirate very much anymore. And so a lot of pirates, were becoming privateers as a way to not be arrested as pirates, especially as more conflicts started to break out in the 1730s. So yeah, piracy just kind of did peter out. After 1730, after the Golden Age of Piracy ends, we never see, at least in the, within the Atlantic world, we don't see organized bands of pirates like that ever again, except for some one-offs that would happen here and there. Piracy still exists, but not the way it did during the Golden Age.
Is there one pirate that you think most people might not have heard of that you would like people to know about? Yeah, a favorite obscure pirate.
That's a really, really good one. There was a pirate named John King who ended up sailing for Sam Bellamy. And what's really interesting is that he was about 10 years old when he became a pirate for Sam Bellamy, and it was because he wanted to. He had heard the stories of pirates and thought it sounded really cool. And then I think Sam Bellamy attacked the ship he and his mom were sailing on, and he told his mom, "I'm joining the pirate ship. I'm going to be a pirate." And she didn't want him to. Of course, the mother's not going to want her child to do that. But John King practically threatened to kill himself or throw himself overboard if she didn't let him. And so, so she does. And Sam Bellamy absorbs John King into his crew. And so now we've got like a 10-year-old who just desperately wanted to become a pirate. Unfortunately, though, Sam Bellamy and his ship get caught in a storm off the coast of Massachusetts in 1718, and they crash, and all but 2 members of the crew are killed in this crash, including John King, and which is quite tragic. But I just think he's quite interesting because it just shows how the romance of piracy was existing during this time of pirates.
Yeah, it's a sad story, but an interesting one. This has been absolutely fascinating. I can't wait till next time when we're going to learn a bit more about piracy as well. But I always like to give guests the opportunity at the end of an episode to hop into the Assassin's Creed Animus and travel back in time. So if you could head back to any moment during the Golden Age of Piracy, or perhaps sit down and have a chat with any pirate, when would you go, or who would you want to sit down with?
So I would love to go to Nassau, like around maybe 1715-ish, like right before Woodes Rogers comes in and piracy is kind of at the height of the time. I would love to be in Nassau and just hanging out in the taverns and just walking up and just talking to pirates. All of them, the really famous ones and the not famous ones, just to kind of be like, tell me why. I'm so interested, legitimately.
Yeah, soak up the pirate ambiance in Nassau.
Yeah. I think it'd be really interesting to talk to Edward Teach, as we know as Blackbeard, because he was all about using the act of surprise and intimidation to get people to surrender. He grew out a very long beard, looking really, really frightening. Supposedly, he put little twists of gunpowder into his beard and would light them so you'd have smoke coming off of him. I would love to be able to meet Blackbeard and be like, who are you? How did you get into this? And I'd want to know if all of that is true. I'd love to know, like, did he actually put these, gunpowder into his beard? What was his actual process?
I always think as well, people like Blackbeard, with that thing with the gunpowder in his beard, if it's not true, it'd be so interesting to say that to him, and he'd be like, "People think I did what?"
Yeah.
They think I set myself on fire.
Yeah, exactly.
But this has been absolutely fascinating, Rebecca. I've really, really enjoyed this survey of kind of piracy in the Caribbean, and I'm really looking forward to next time we're going to get into something a little bit more specific, and we're going to talk about some of the main events that happened, and particularly about the Pirate Republic as well. I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you very, very much for joining us. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
You're welcome. I'm really excited for the ones coming up. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Thanks for watching this episode of Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and share with your friends, and subscribe for more interviews with experts about the real history that inspires Assassin's Creed. I'll see you next time.